All right, what's going on, everyone? We're going to take a look at some news coming out of Afghanistan from 19 to 25 November 2022. That's about a week ago, but it gives us enough time for the news to kind of settle out, some of these stories to be picked up by multiple organizations so they can be corroborated before I present them here. Really since the Taliban took over in August 2021, news coming out of that country has been pretty sporadic, and at times all we have access to is what the Taliban allows to be sent out. But today we're going to take a look at a handful of stories. We've got some cross-border shelling with Pakistan, the Taliban having to deal with their own kind of insurgency of a sort with the National Resistance Front up in the Panjshir. We've got a case where Afghan citizens took the Dutch government to court and won around an illegal airstrike that took place back in 2007. And finally, some news about the implementation of Sharia law in Afghanistan. And as far as I've seen, the first reports of public punishments. Doesn't sound quite as graphic as what was seen pre-9/11, but potentially the Taliban heading back in that direction. All right, starting off, a Taliban spokesperson on November 17th said they will stick to their strict interpretation of Sharia Islamic law. Not really a surprise. I think most of us saw this coming. Technically, they never really wavered from that. But right when the Taliban took over back in August of 2021, they did signal to the international community that they might moderate some of their views, especially when it comes to women's and minority rights. However, it kind of seems like they're going in a different direction. As of now, women are banned from parks, gyms, most jobs. They have to cover themselves from head to toe, and girls are forbidden to attend school after 6th grade. We'll get into a story here in a little bit about the punishments that they're handing out actually when some of these laws are broken as well. Shifting over some of the conflict in the region, Taliban and Pakistani forces continued to engage in shelling across the border, something we talked about last week. On November 20th, shelling resulted in over a dozen casualties between civilians and security forces of both sides, including at least 2 fatalities. These clashes aren't anything new. They've been going on for a while, and the violence is kind of continuing there. We haven't talked about the National Resistance Front yet, and I'll go into a little more detail on exactly who that is here in a second. But there were some reports saying across Afghanistan, but I think it was relatively limited to 2 provinces. Anti-Taliban groups engaged in multiple clashes with Taliban forces last week. The National Resistance Front, or NRF, launched a number of deadly attacks on Taliban forces in Takhar province, while the Afghanistan Freedom Front also reportedly killed 2 Taliban members during an attack in Kandahar city. So the National Resistance Front, again NRF, at a high level is a group of former Northern Alliance members and other anti-Taliban factions. The Northern Alliance were the ones that the U.S. partnered with back in 2001, 2002, right when we first went into the country, taking the fight against al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Then when the Taliban took over in August of 21, the National Resistance Front kind of set up shop in the Panjshir Valley up in the north. Over the last few months, the Taliban have claimed a couple times, I believe, that they now control that territory, the Panjshir. The NRF has disputed it, but I'd say overall the safe takeaway here is the National Resistance Front continues to operate, but they're somewhat contained by the Taliban. This is a pretty big story here. It's not in Afghanistan, but related to Afghanistan. On November 23rd, a local court in the Netherlands ruled that Dutch forces unlawfully bombed a residential complex in Afghanistan in 2007 and ordered the state to pay financial compensation to the victims. The District Court of The Hague found the late-night attack on a compound that left some 20 civilians dead violated international humanitarian law. The court sided with 4 survivors of the attack who brought a civil suit against the Dutch state for compensation. Got a whole mix of emotions on this one. Tragic that anybody had to die. Positive in the sense that if anything was done on the battlefield immorally or illegally, that those responsible are brought to justice in some way, shape, or form. And interesting in this case because these survivors are Afghan citizens, and it sounds like they sued the Dutch government and won. Continuing on, the Defense Ministry argued that buildings were being used by Taliban fighters when the military hit the walled compound known as a Kalat with munitions fired from attack helicopters and F-16s. The Dutch were part of the U.S.-led coalition fighting in Afghanistan at the time. However, some 12 hours had passed from the last time the Taliban used the location as a firing position when the bombing occurred, and judges concluded that the military did not have enough information to designate the compound as a military target. There's a lot to unpack there, and we'll have to read between the lines a little bit. The judge ruled that the families of the victims will be compensated. I didn't see anything in here about placing blame on an individual within the military. That's generally a hard standard to meet. If you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, where the United States at least has been involved most heavily over the last 20 years, there's a lot of awful situations in the fog of war where non-combatants could be killed. Just as some high-level examples, bombs malfunction and can fly off target. So if the proper coordinates are given and there's a problem with the bomb, you tend to not see individual soldiers held responsible. Or if enemy fighters start firing on you from a position and they have civilians hold up in that compound that they won't let go or they put in harm's way and they are killed or wounded, again, that's not usually placed on the soldier or the forces that were attacked. It's considered kind of out of their control and a very, very unfortunate piece of collateral damage when it comes to war. But that's not what I see here. 12 hours between the time the Taliban used the compound and when it was struck is a very long time. Rules of engagement are constantly changing, but generally speaking, an airstrike is not going to be carried out unless positive identification of the enemy combatant can be confirmed. A part of that often is not just confirming that the enemy is there, but confirming there are no civilians in the immediate area. What this sounds like to me is someone on the ground confirming that this was in fact a legitimate military target that only contained enemy fighters, not civilians, and whether they just made that up or they were lying, at the end of the day, it was inaccurate, and this is what happens. It doesn't sound like they're pursuing any individual in terms of culpability here, but if I see anything that changes on that front, I'll let you know. Finally, I mentioned we were going to talk about some of the punishments being doled out in Afghanistan, and we've got two here. Pre-9/11, there were some pretty grainy and graphic videos of public executions being carried out in like soccer stadiums in Afghanistan. I don't think they've gotten to that point. I haven't seen any reports that that is necessarily happening, but public punishment in the form of beatings are starting to come out a little bit. On November 20th, 19 people in northeastern Afghanistan were lashed for adultery, theft, and running away from home. A Supreme Court official, Abdul Rahim Rashid, said 10 men and 9 women were lashed 39 times each in northeast Takhar province. He said the punishment took place in the presence of elders, scholars, and residents at the city's main mosque after Friday prayers. And on November 23rd, the Taliban lashed 3 women and 9 men in front of hundreds of spectators in a provincial sports stadium. Those being punished received between 29 and 39 lashes each after being convicted in a local court of theft and adultery, said an official in the governor's office. The official said hundreds of people attended the lashings and that a ban was imposed on taking photos and videos. But that'll do it for now. We'll see y'all next time.